Steve, thanks for joining us, man.
Hey, thanks, Matt. It's great to be with you today. And we're not in the same room, so we don't have to worry about transferring any unfriendly germs and stuff like that.
That's right. We're literally in the future here. This is how most students right now for the next probably month or so are going to be doing school.
Yep,
So you're in good company. If you're watching us on Facebook, if you're watching us through the webinar, this is the only way you could watch us right now. So it works out well.
that's right.
And I
Oh,
think,
man.
I think also like, man, what a great time to be talking about financing the mission,
Yeah,
because in a time like this, the economy kind of starts to take a crunch. And the first thing every board wants to tell you is, get ready, pastor, because the giving's going to shrink because the people are worried about the economy. And so
right.
that's what I really am so excited about this conversation is
Yeah,
you're going to share a model that's not just dependent on tithes and offerings, but you're really going to look at the whole scope of how a
right.
church can plant. And I think the church of the 21st century desperately, desperately needs that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This, you're right. This is actually, it's kind of an important thing that's happening to our whole culture right now. Obviously, the response of the stock market has really kind of exposed how fragile everything really is when it's based on some ideas and principles that we start to assume are just solid and normal and everything's just going to keep going that way, and all of a sudden it's not. That reality feels very unsure, and that's why the stock market's reacting the way it does. And so the weird thing is this is something that's happened obviously just over the last few weeks, but the same thing is happening in much slower motion on a grander scale in terms of how churches are going to be funding themselves way into the future, and especially the 21st century future. Because what's happening is the funding model of the 20th century, which was based on the assumption that a church could gather a group of people together who were all basically familiar with the concept of tithing and very quickly sort of generate enough reliable income to pay for buildings and salaries and operational costs of a church. That model that has been pretty reliable for a long, long time, probably for at least the last 100 years or so, that's been the dominant model of the church. And what's happening is everything's shifting a lot more slowly than what's happening with coronavirus, but we're headed into a day when churches will no longer be able to rely on that assumption that there'll be enough income coming from tithes and offerings that it will support kind of church as normal. So that's what we have to, if we're going to skate to where the puck is going to be, and maybe in many places the puck already is there and we've got to get there.
Yeah.
We've got to think about a different way of thinking about money.
Yeah, and I'm really excited that you're having this conversation with us now because, this was a huge conversation. I just went to Exponential 2020 in Orlando. This is a huge conversation out there. There's some incredible books and resources that are starting to come out around that. But I think to the point that you were talking about, the old model was let's gather a bunch of church people together. And, the only thing I think about is most of the conversations we have about church planting, even, on our Facebook group that we have, or just in general, most of us didn't start out saying, hey, what I'd love to do is I'd love to kind of parachute into an area and just find a bunch of church people and get them together, maybe find a space that we can worship and just, worship together in a new, more fun way. No, most of us come in saying, I want to reach people that are disconnected from God, that are lost. And yet we step in with a tithing model that's built on a bunch of saved people gathering together. And then we wrestle with this tension of why isn't this working? Why isn't, how come they're not giving? Well, because they don't know Jesus. And am I supposed to sacrifice that mission of reaching them so
Right.
that I can fit that into my tithing and ecclesiastical model? I
Yeah.
think so. That's probably why I'm so excited today.
Yeah.
Maybe a
Yeah.
little more
Yeah.
amped up than usual.
Well, and you've actually described the crux of the challenge is that the 20th century model of funding actually de-incentivizes us from going to the places and to the people who are, I think, based on my reading of scripture, kind of supposed to be the focus of our efforts. And so that's really contradictory. And you're right. It's if you even go beyond the financing strategies, just most of the strategies that people use to start churches nowadays are really kind of still have this assumption that there's a bunch of Christians out there that can be quickly mobilized and get going that way. And so so we've got to, so here's the problem. That isn't going to work. It's not going to work in the near future for sure if you're going to a place where there's not a lot of tithe paying people just ready to be activated. And in the long term, it's not going to work, period, because economics are changing, things are shifting, costs are costs are increasing. Income generated by tithes and offerings has some downward pressure on it. There's it's not going to happen tomorrow, but someday it's possible that the government's going to take away the tax benefit of being charitable. I don't think that's an imminent threat, but it's not a bad idea. It's really better to be prepared. It's like Joseph preparing the Egyptians for years of famine instead of waiting until it happened, having a plan going into it. So I'm excited today to share a proactive plan. Now, I want to say up front, it's not a magic trick. It's not some little cool thing. You just do this. It's going to be really hard. And it's going to require some creativity. It's going to require some supernatural intervention from God and some supernatural creativity that comes from God. Here's the cool thing. We're in touch with the one who said, "Let there be light," and the whole universe exploded into existence. So we got the right creative brain on our side, and he does. If God wants his church to be successful and to thrive, and so it's not like we're just figuring this out on our own. But there's always this tension. There's what God does and only he can do. That's the miracle side. And then there's what we do, and that's the practical strategic side. And so what we're going to talk about today is just really practical, kind of challenging, difficult things, but actual things we can do that will make the future of the church stable, sustainable, and it'll allow us to go to places right now that our current model actually kind of causes us to shy away from. So that means with the approach we're going to talk about today, we can go anywhere. It doesn't matter where it is. We can figure out how to make that financially sustainable. All right. So you ready to dive into it, man?
I love I love where you started here, because it's going to almost sound like with this first point, well, they're kind of going against everything they were just so passionately talking about. But really what you're saying is there's still a spot for the tithes and the offerings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that's a fundamental stewardship issue. Here's the problem. We've turned tithes and offerings into a funding, like the funding plan for the church. And that's really not what was ever intended to be. It actually has to do with protecting our heart. It's giving tithes and offerings is about the heart of the disciple. It's about keeping our heart focused on God's things. Scripture says where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. And so God built into kind of how he relates to us. He said, look, as a part of our relationship, I want you to remind yourself on a regular basis that everything that you have belongs to him. It comes from God. It belongs to God. We're just stewards of his stuff. And what he wants us to do is give is tangibly demonstrate our understanding of that by taking a good chunk. I mean, the biblical standard is kind of 10%, like a minimum of 10% of your revenue personally coming to you is to be given with no strings attached to God's work. And in doing so, it does something, it breaks something open in our heart that is so important for us. So yeah, I would never say, well, we're just going to do away with tithes and offerings, but we have to really think
Yeah.
about them differently. They're not there to pay bills with. Oh yeah, in the end, at the end of the day, they get put into the pot out of which bills are paid. So yeah, they do end up being utilized to fund the ministry of the church, but that's not why we do it, and that's not what they're really about. It's not about paying bills, it's about protecting our heart. And that's really an important shift in our thinking, away from, oh man, our dependency is on the money that comes in the offering. We do that to help people be healthy in their relationship with God.
Well, I think that's a really healthy thing for me to hear, because I know, one of the realities of not just, I don't even think just church planting, but I think ministry is, if you are tithing, which, I have a policy on staff, everybody on my staff will be a tither, because I believe it's a heart issue. We tithe, my family tithes, but what I found is that has often meant that I am, even though I probably shouldn't be, if everybody was tithing, I'm one of the top givers
Mm-hmm.
in the church. Whether if you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about the church plant, don't be
Mm-hmm.
surprised if you pop into the top
Right.
one or two, or even
Right.
top five. If you're even at an existing church, don't be surprised if you end up in the top 10.
Right.
And I've sometimes looked at that as, it's kind of been a sore spot for me, and kind of been like, oh, why aren't
Mm-hmm.
people giving more? But to kind of hear the way that you're talking about it and saying, look, it's not about us saying, well, if we had more tithers, we'd pay all these bills, but more of that, this is about your guarding your heart and being a good model for people
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
stewardship. And so that's why we don't get rid of the tithes and offerings.
And yeah, and it's about guarding their heart. It's like your response. So some ministers, especially church planners, we get all freaked out about talking about money because we know people don't like to hear that. Well, I think because, again, we talk about it in this transactional way, like, well, there's all kinds of really bad theology about money and giving out there that is either transactional, like, okay, you pay your tithes so God doesn't kill you, or something like that, or you pay your tithes so God will bless you. You pay your tithes for this or that. No, 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 no. That's not, any of those things are not why we do it. There are some byproducts. God blesses a cheerful giver. We know all that's true, but again, it's really, really important. So here's the thing: talking about money, teaching about finances is part of the responsibility of the leader. But the way that you approach it is not with these bad theological things that turn people off. It's more, no, do you want to be a healthy follower of Christ? Here's how you tangibly demonstrate that you actually do trust him. You say you trust him. How do you do that? Well, this is one of the ways we do that. And so it is the responsibility of a church. And so I think, again, each one of these revenue streams we talk about, my thing would be, I think it's going to be crucial for us going forward to maximize the revenue that comes in through all these streams. So I would never suggest that we do anything intentionally to reduce the amount of tithes and offerings coming in. Here's the thing: you know what? I have never in my entire life, I have helped thousands of people plant churches. Nobody has ever called me up or texted me or emailed me a question and said, you know what? I have too much money. I just don't know what to do with it. No, I have too much money, said no church planter, anytime, anywhere, anyhow. That never happened. So I am not in any way advocating that let's do away with tithes and offerings, or it's even okay that we de-emphasize it. No, I think it needs to be emphasized very strongly, very clearly, but for the right reasons. And here's the thing: often we find ourselves in this position where we think tithes and offerings are our only source of revenue. Therefore, we've got to figure out how to give people, get people to give more. And that's when we rely on all these kind of, unhealthy theological, manipulatory things where we put people on guilt trips, or, God will bless you if you give. All these stupid things come out of a wrong understanding of what's going on with the tithe. Okay. So, so it's,
Well, and
let's
that's why I'm excited about this next one that you share. And of course, for me, it was a little confusing. The next one you shared was donor
Yeah,
based. And here's why it was confusing for me, because I think a lot of times in a church setting, we call the people that give our givers or our donors.
donors, right, right.
So somebody may be looking at that and go, are you just saying tithes and offerings again when you say donor based? Are you talking about a different group?
I totally am talking about a different group. So every church, especially, again, here's the advantage, if you will, of going to a place where there's not a lot of tithers and a lot of givers. Usually it's uh, that's a quote unquote better story to tell to people who are not part of that community about, hey, look at this. We're going to this place. It's an underserved place. It's an overlooked place. It's a, there's a lot of people who are on the low end of the economic spectrum here, or there's a high level of religious confusion going on here. Anyway, the point is you got a story to tell. And so when we talk about donors, and I do realize this is a little, it feels like it's the same thing, but it's very different. Here's how it's different. Tithes and offering people are givers who are actually part of that local congregation. They join together with you for worship every week. They see themselves, this is their church, they are part of it. That's what we would call people who we appeal to for tithes and offerings. That's the tithes and offerings revenue stream. The donor-based revenue stream would be people, organizations, businesses, whatever you want to, any place you go to where you're saying to them, hey, we're going to this underserved, difficult place, and we need some financial partners to help fund our ability to be there and our ability to be part of it. So this category falls into the more traditional, if you will, fundraising category, and everything that applies in the world of fundraising definitely applies in this stream. So here's my point. Not only do you want to generate maximum revenue from the people who are directly part of the ministry and even directly benefiting from it, but you want to give everybody you possibly can anywhere the opportunity to say, wow, that is a compelling need that Matt and his team are addressing, and I want to play a role in addressing that need. And so that means, usually, so again, going back to why do people give tithes? Well, that's about stewardship. But we're talking about donors. Often the reason donors give, people outside of it, they're giving their stewardship is being exercised in their local church. So this is over and above the tithe. This is money that they say, wow, I'm compelled by that need that Matt is telling me about, and I feel like God is prompting me to do something about that. And so you want to give as many people and as many places the opportunity to do that. And so that means cultivating a donor network, cultivating, reaching out. It means, often for a planter, it means reaching back to churches and people that you've known in your past that don't live. So let's just say, whatever, you currently live in New York City and you're planting a church in Kansas City or something like that. The tithe people are going to come from Kansas City, but perhaps 100 or 200 or 500 people back in New York City that when they hear the story of the place that you're going in Kansas City, some of them are going to say, wow, I really want to be part of helping Matt do something about that. And so this is a second stream of revenue, but it's really a whole different process. It's a different appeal. In this case, you're probably going to tell them something. You do need to find what is the compelling thing about this place that makes it so important for you to be successful there. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. We had a guy when I was living in Springfield, Missouri, and I was attending a church there that was located there in Springfield, Missouri, and it's in Greene County, which is a county in Missouri. Anyway, this guy came and he was telling us about it was a presentation about opioid problems, and he talked about how and these are not the right numbers, but I just remember the numbers were something like across the nation, 2 out of every 1,000 people have an opioid addiction problem.
Mm.
That's just the general. And again, these are not the right numbers, but it
Yeah,
was.
yeah.
And then he said, in the state of Missouri, 4 out of every 1,000 people have an opioid problem. But in Greene County, where this church is located, that I'm going to, he said it's something like 75 out of every 1,000. I mean, it was, again, those are not the right numbers, but they were very dramatically different. I mean, the difference between the Greene County and the national was huge, was enormous, and it was shocking. And and he said, and here's why that is. And he answered the question that immediately popped in everybody's mind. Well, why is it so much worse here in Greene County? And why isn't somebody doing something about it? And he gave some examples of things, efforts that were being made. And he said, here's how we're going to address this problem and bring about a solution. And so, man, he had me, because what he did was he showed the need very clearly. He told the story of a compelling need, and then he explained why that need wasn't being met. And then he explained what he was going to do about it. And then his next thing was, here's how you can help us do that. And so,
wow. Yeah.
I got my checkbook out and I'm writing the check, because I'm thinking, he just connected the money that I currently have in my bank account. He connected a way for me to react to my distress about what I just heard by doing something very practical right now. Okay, so that's my point. Then that's actually a formula that I just shared. You tell a compelling need, share a compelling need clearly, explain why that need's not already being met, tell them how you're going to meet that need, or how you're going to address it, or what you're going to do to help deal with it, and then give them the opportunity to invite them to be part of that solution.
Well, and I think that's huge, because what you're saying is, you can't step into a donor base, an outside donor base, and say, just support our church. But what's that need you're meeting? What's that compelling story that people can be invited into? And I think the other thing you said, and this is subtle, but I caught this from a guy that does donor stuff for Habitat for Humanity and things like that. He said, you're using language like invest or opportunity. You're not saying, I need your money, quote unquote, but you're helping people catch that kind of like kingdom investment language as you're sharing that as well, which is so important.
Yeah, and you also give people options. Obviously, one of the options that most believers can participate in fact, I think all believers can participate in, the prayer option. So that's you give them options that don't include money, but you also help them. And it's even good to say, depending on the situation, you might say, well, here's what $100 will do. If $100 will create this kind of impact on this problem that we just told you about. Now, you got to make sure you're not just making stuff up, and so you have to be really careful about how you say that. But it helps people. You want to help people have a connection between, okay, there's money in my bank right now, and I can leave that money there and earn interest, or I can actually, do something with it that's going to help solve this problem. And you're right. Here's the other thing. This is a huge mistake that most church planners make. And I've alluded this, but I want to make this really clear. So most people don't really understand the need for church planting intuitively. When they hear you say, hey, we want you to help us plant this church, most people's intuitive reaction to that is, well, aren't there already a whole bunch of churches? Why do we need another church? That's the most common thought that goes through people's heads. So that's why you have to go way beyond. If you're building donor support from people who are not part of the church and not part of that community that you're doing the church in, you've got to help them understand how this is not just another church, but and so that means you do your homework. But there's usually, again, the reason you're going there, especially if it's hard place, the answer's right in front of your face, or, the
Yeah.
compelling need. It's what is drawing you there. And so you might say, well, the research shows that whatever 50% of people who live in kids are being raised in single parent families, and this church is built to serve single parent households, and the children and the parents that are leading single parent families. So all of a sudden you just said, we're doing something really tangible, practical to meet the needs of 50% of people in this community. Now, there may not be any place that has that. I don't know. But the point is, you do that's why you do the demographic research, to know what's going on here, and usually there's something about the community. And you also have to think about who are the people you're talking to, as far as appealing to donors. So if you're talking to a church, often they're motivated by the spiritual needs of people. And so you could say, hey, we found out that 75% of people in this community would self-identify as they don't believe in anything. They're nuns. So for church people, that could be very motivating. Oh, this guy's going to a place, and you can explain to him, here's our plan to help nuns become founds, or lost become founds, or however you want to say it. But if you're talking to an organization that provides counseling services for single people that are single parents or something like that, clearly you're going to present your ministry in terminology that matters to them. So again, that's part of, and I'm sure if you've hung around with people that do a lot of fundraising stuff, this is just all basic fundraising stuff, but it's just
I think that's really important what you're bringing up, that a lot of this is like really basic fundraising stuff, because also that means there's a lot of great resources out there as well.
Exactly.
On nonprofit donors and stuff like that. But before we move off that subject and we move into the next point, which I'm really excited to talk about, just give guys a 30,000 foot view. How can they create an initial donor base list for themselves and their church?
Yeah. Well, I want to, so however long you've lived, you've met people throughout your whole life. So my first recommendation is to tap into the relational network that you already have, or the people that you're already connected to. So my first step for people is sit down and write down the names of everybody you've ever known, from as far back as you can even think, even if it's people that you don't even know where they live now. It's just, but if you write down their names, so it could be, little Jimmy, who you went to kindergarten with, 25 years ago, and you don't know where he's at now, but you just remember you had this friend in kindergarten, his name was Jimmy. Well, write his name on the list. You never know what might happen when you start really being deliberate and intentional about identifying all the people that you already know. And that's your base that you start with, is who you're immediately directly connected to, because of you just living life and being a person who socializes and connects with other people. And it's from those folks then that other opportunities are going to come. And that's the whole secret, is basically leveraging that foundational relational network you already have, to then begin to find, sometimes you'll know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, and you don't, but to get to the fourth person, you got to start with somebody you already know. And so that's why so I would just say that's the big task up front, is start with that. If you want to get the most out of that, don't just think of the people you know right now. Don't just think of the people that are immediately in your life, but think about people that have been part of your life for a long time, and be really deliberate about writing them down, and then do the research to figure out, where are they now? Facebook is like a dream come true for people who are doing these relational network things, because you can track down a lot of information about a lot of people that's just sitting right out there on Facebook. And that will allow you then to eventually perhaps get in touch with them. But here's the thing, I always say, before you start doing any phone calling or letter sending or any of that kind of stuff, start praying. Pray over these people. Pray over the people that you've listed, because those are the precious resources that God has put into your life. You know, the steps of a righteous person are ordered of the Lord. All the days have been ordained. So nobody has come through your life by accident. If you're following Christ, every person you've ever met, there's a reason for that encounter. And it could be that this is it. It doesn't necessarily mean automatically they're all, you know, that's the other don't make the mistake of thinking every one of those people is going to become a $10,000 donor, you know,
Yeah.
because that's
Yeah.
probably not going to happen. And so,
No, I think that's a really, really solid place to start. And then I always say, don't answer your no for them. Don't answer their no
yeah.
for them. I
Oh,
mean,
absolutely.
we'll do that too. We won't write their name. Well, oh, they would never be interested. So you don't write their name down, and maybe they're looking for an opportunity.
No,
like that.
the name, you should write everybody down, even like somebody, you know, that hates you and hates God, and you just think there's no way this person ever give. You just never know. And so you start by that name, and that name becomes a prayer list for you. And here's the other thing. Don't do the knee-jerk thing of, once you get that list made and you get like a address thing, sending out either an email or even actual physical letters. Hey, I'm planting a church and I need your money. You know, people do that all the time, where they send out these emails and they think that just one email is going to generate a ton of support. Even if you have all your stuff ready to go and your links, just click this link here and you can support it. That's not your best first step with contacting those folks. You know, that's really important to remember. It's always better to ask face to face. Now, in this day and age, face to face could mean doing what we're doing right now, but which is actually easier and cheaper and way more accessible. So it's, in some ways, this is the future. I think more and more people are going to realize, wait, we can get a lot done just through this. But the point is, having this interactive deal is way better than just a letter that they get. And so here's the thing. If you are going to send out a letter sort of notifying, hey, everybody, I'm starting on this journey. And, you know, the purpose of that letter is actually to say, over the next few months, or however long you want to make the time frame, I'm going to be contacting you to just because you're one of my friends, you're somebody that I'm thinking about and praying for. And I just want to let you know, I'm going to be contacting you because I want to share with you what we're doing and how you might be able to have a part in that, or something like that. So you give people a heads up so they know you're coming and they know you're going to be asking for something. And that's actually a good thing. It sounds like, oh no, now they have time to think of how they're going to say no. That just means here's the thing you said earlier, and this is true. Don't say they're no for them. That's absolutely correct. On the other hand, do your absolute best to make it really easy for them to say yes. So that's what you want to spend your time for. You know, as you prepare for your meeting with them, you want to go in with an optimistic approach, thinking if they say no, it's not going to be because I didn't give them every opportunity to say yes. The only way they're going to say no is because they really do have a really good reason. And so that's the best way to set yourself up for success, and is having a plan where, again, going back to that formula, if you share a compelling need, explain why that need's not being met, show how you're going to meet that need, and then invite them to be part of it, that really makes it hard to say no to. They're going to find something to say yes in that, you know, most people. And if they don't, you can sleep well knowing you gave it your absolute best shot, you know, and that's all on them. And that's really important to do. That's probably I mean, there's a whole bunch here. We could talk forever on this and like you said, the great thing about fundraising is there's a bazillion good resources out there. So I would just suggest,
that's awesome,
you know, that maybe that is one of the, you know, besides what I started with, write down the names, but maybe before that, get a good fundraising resource. You know, if you don't already have one, the organization you're with may be able to point you to there's so many good ones out there. And, you know, just because what we find is a lot of people have so many blockages to fundraising in their own mentality that stop them before they even get started. So anyway, okay,
That's
that's
huge.
number two.
That's huge. So I love this next one that you've got, because this has been a huge topic of conversation. It's gone under a few different monikers,
Yeah,
co-vocational.
yeah,
Talk to me about your experience with it, but what do you really mean too? Because we should really define the term. What do you really mean
right.
when you say
Yeah,
co-vocational?
yeah. So I most people for years, I think they've called this idea bivocational. And the idea was that, you're working a full-time job, and then you have this other full-time job called being a pastor. So it's, the idea of bivocational pastors has been around kind of forever. And honestly, I think for many people, they've thought of it as sort of a second best thing behind being a
Yeah.
full-time. That people have always sort of designated that as, yeah, well, if you can't get a real job as a real pastor, you can be a bivocational pastor. And it's sort of been a demeaning moniker and stuff like that. And so I think what's happened over the last few years, I've noticed, I've, going to places like Exponential, and anytime church planners are gathering, the language has really migrated away from bivocational. And another downside of bivocational is the word bi actually implies bifurcation. It's like you're dividing yourself, so you're
Yeah.
doing this and then you're doing this. And it's really, really difficult for most people to do two really different things well. And so in that sense, there was some reason why people thought of bivocational as a less helpful way of being in ministry, is because people who are truly doing that. I mean, I had tried to help a guy start a church one time, and he was working, he was a full-time manager at this big company, or retail store that was about an hour from where he lived. So he spent 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, working at this big retail store. And then he spent 2 hours a day in just commuting, to get to the job and get back. So he's getting paid well, but he was, he's spending 10 hours a day, 50 hours a week, literally not in the neighborhood, not in the community where he was trying to then build a faith community. And, he also happened to have a lot of children. I think he had 5 or 6 kids, so
Wow.
by the time he got home from work, had dinner with the kid, with his wife and kids, he gave his kids some attention, and they went to the park and played or whatever they did, there wasn't a whole lot of day left over for him to do anything that had to do with the church. And so his church stuff is restricted primarily to the weekends, and you got to have some margin somewhere. So maybe I don't even need to say it, but that just didn't work. That
Yeah.
did not work out.
Yeah.
And so it's stories like that have made people kind of shy away. And so what's cool is what's happened is people have begun to shift their thinking about this. And this word co-vocational, the co part kind of it can refer to compatible, it can cooperative. The idea is that you find a way to generate revenue. This third revenue stream is generating revenue that helps you do the ministry, but you do it in a co-vocational way, in a way that is compatible, cooperative with the process of starting a faith community. And so that can take on a lot of different ways of thinking. Now, one of those, let's just start with many, not everybody, but many people who are starting churches are married. And so they have a spouse. And so a lot of times the way we've thought about the spousal income is that is not even supposed to be factored in. But when you think about the endeavor of starting a new church, I'm telling you, if the spouse isn't all in, it isn't going to happen. So
Yeah.
not only financially, but in every other imaginable way. And so I think it's actually healthy for couples to consider, we, not just the lead planter, but we together have a responsibility to be to create part of the revenue stream that will support us. And so 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 that's one piece of this co-vocational thing, is that you and your spouse actually decide, we're going to be all in on this, and the spouse's income is going to be part of the consideration of, do we have, because here's the question that's all part of sustainability, is we want these people who are the catalysts, the starters of these churches, we want them to have minimal financial stress as possible, you know.
Mhm.
So there's this old mentality about, you know, church pastors and church leaders should kind of be starving and all this kind of, I don't know where that came from, but it's just a bad idea. You know, we think it's reasonable for people who are living in a particular community, whatever that community is, they need to be living at a level that is kind of average for that community. They shouldn't be at the bottom of the economic spectrum there, but they also aren't going to be served well if they're like way better off than most people in the community. So, you know, a lot of times we say a good guideline, kind of a rule of thumb, is what is the pay that a junior high principal or a grade school principal is receiving in that community. It's not a perfect guideline, but it gives you an idea of kind of what does it really cost to live here, you know.
I like that because it's also really tangible.
Yeah,
So you've got a marker that you can go off. So especially because I think that's one of the struggles as well when you're starting a church and you're trying to evaluate co-vocational versus, you know, full-time into the ministry, and you're trying to justify your salary and you feel like, you know, how do I justify that? Well, if you've got a marker like that, that's kind of set by other people, you can say, look, this is the standard for other public service kind of industries, and let's
exactly,
go with that.
that's the whole idea. And so that gives you a tangible number to shoot at, that your sending organization can see the rationale. And because one of the worst things I've seen happen, especially for people going into urban settings, you know, their salary is set by this random salary number that is chosen by, you know, their sending organization. And you know, a lot of these sending organizations are based in either suburban or rural settings. And so, you know, they think, oh yeah, most people can make it on 36 grand a year, you know, so that'll be our standard deal. But you try to live in any city for 36 grand a year, and you are going to be below the poverty line, most likely, in terms of the cost of living and all that, when you factor all that stuff in. So, you know, your city salary, like just getting by level, is probably going to be more, you know, in the, well, it's hard to say because it varies so much. But the point is, that's why you have something that's a localized marker that you can point to and go, okay, our target, we think our family can live in a sustainable way where we're not financially stressed out for this amount. Let's just say 80,000. Okay. Let's just say 80 grand a year. Okay. Now in most church planting organizations, that's going to raise eyebrows. Whoa, that's way more than we pay church plan. Okay. So the way to fight that battle a little bit is to say, okay, now that number, in our case, we're going to include the income that's coming from our spouse, you know, from the spouse. So my spouse is bringing in 25 grand. So we now have a deficit. If the number's 80,000, we need to come up with 55 grand, you know, a year. And again, I mean, these are, they may be way too low, or they may be, you know, high, depending on where people are at. But the point is, you do factor the spouse into it. So then you say, okay, now where's that 55, or where's the rest of it going to come from, so that our family doesn't sit around at night and, you know, open a can of beans and, you know, count how many beans each person gets, you know? And
No,
so
I think that's huge.
So co-vocational so this mentality then becomes, wait a minute, is there anything that I have, is there any skill that I have, or is there an opportunity here that I can take advantage of that will generate revenue for the security of my family in a way that is compatible with the work of starting a new faith community? And so the answer to that,
I kind of heard you say earlier too, like compatible doesn't necessarily mean ministry or similar occupation. It could just be, hey, this job is in the center of my community. And
that's right.
so I'll,
That's
you know,
right.
like, for example, if the store manager wasn't driving an hour away, to do
Right.
his job,
Yeah.
it could have been the perfect job
That could
for
have been
him
a
to
perfect,
sustain.
exactly, because then he's actually interacting with people, and he's they're experiencing him, his presence, his faith, and everything else in real time, in real life. And so, yeah, like just garden variety co-vocational kind of things that a lot of people are doing are things like working at a coffee shop as a barista. Now you're in a place, you're not going to generate a ton of money, but it is positive revenue. And you can choose in places like that. Usually you can say, hey, I'm looking for a part-time job. I'm looking for maybe 10 to 15 hours a week. And if you're getting paid minimum wage, whatever that may be, it's not going to be a tremendous amount of money, but it counts towards, so you could say, okay, part of my strategy is I'm going to work 10 hours a week at this coffee shop, and I'm going to make 100 extra bucks a week. Okay, so over the month, that's like 425 bucks or whatever it works out to be. Okay, so over the year, that's, whatever that would be. My math is terrible. So it's somewhere around probably in the neighborhood of 5 grand, So that's okay. Now you just need to come up with 50 grand.
Well,
Uh,
and I think too, your people start to look at you differently. I noticed this. My friend Jim leads Young Life, and he in his previous career was a lawyer, and he had
yeah,
kind of like let all that kind of go to the side. And as he's doing Young Life, launching a Young Life out here, like things have been going well, but it was always super tight. And so finally, he just said, you know what? I think I'm going to try and get some legal work again and kind of revive that legal thing. And so he started doing the co-vocational thing, doing legal contracts and housing closings and things like that. And he said, it's amazing because not only has that freed up, money to be able to invest in ministry, it's taken the stress off his family, but
yes,
also other leadership look at him differently because they see him as somebody else that, hey, he works another job too. He's not just in this weird world we call ministry that we
right,
can't quite put our fingers on what you guys do, but we know you do something,
right.
which I think is huge.
That is actually an enormous benefit of a co-vocational approach. I think it's been, people always talk about the downside of, oh, this guy has got this other job, but it actually keeps people connected into quote unquote the real life of the community. And there are so many ancillary benefits from that actually are lost when you become a full-time vocational pastor. So I'm actually a fan of both, and I'm not an either or guy. I'm not going to ever say, I think there's always going to be churches that the best use of the leader, the best way that leader can be effective is in a full-time capacity, guiding the operations of that church. I'm never going to say, I will never say that's going to go away. However, I do think that there's we've gone way out of balance with thinking that that's the only valid thing. And there's a lot of great arguments on the other side. Another benefit to the guy is when you're going to work every day, even if it's for part-time, and then people are saying, hey, I'm really busy, da 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 da. Well, you actually have some moral authority to say, well, I'm busy too.
Yeah, we're
Your
all
friend, the
busy.
lawyer, could say, hey, I was, in the courtroom 3 days this week, or whatever. And so it helps. It really puts people a little bit, they realize, whoa, this guy's sacrificing, I can sacrifice too. And so it's almost easier to get volunteers when they know that the people inviting them to give of their precious free time actually are already doing that themselves.
Yeah.
So and here's the other thing really quick on this. I mean, there are so many, again, let the creativity of the Holy Spirit go, but like especially in cities nowadays, there's just, you can drive Lyft, you can drive Uber, and when you're driving Lyft and Uber, some of the time you're actually taking your neighbors from their home to the bar or to the sporting event or something like that. And so many of our church planners have met people that are now following Jesus, and they met them giving them a ride to the bar or whatever. And so
That is
that
the
was,
that is the best story ever too. If you think
yeah,
about it, it's like somebody sitting next to somebody in church. They're like, "How'd you hear about Grace Hills
yeah,
Church?" "Oh yeah, the pastor was my Uber driver."
yeah, 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 yeah. And so, there's that. And then there's other stuff that it doesn't really interact you with the community per se, but it happens at a time when there's not a whole lot of interactivity happening anyway. So by that, I mean things like, again, in the city, many cities now have these electric scooters. They have to be charged at night and put out early in the morning, and the companies rely on people who live in the city to do that. And so some of our church planners literally go around and pick up scooters at night, take them back to their place, plug them in, charge them up overnight. And one of our planners was making $2,000 a month charging scooters.
Wow.
So that's not bad supplemental income right there. That's 24 grand a year. And the cool thing is he was able to do that, like between 11 and midnight, he'd pick them up. Between 5 and 6, he'd drop them off. Now the problem is he didn't get a lot of sleep. But he had actually his kids helped him do it. And so the point is, and you can design website. There's so many things you can do.
Yeah.
You can do legal stuff that's compatible with leading a faith community. And so again, now we've talked about 3, and if you maximize just those 3, you already are starting to wean yourself off the dependency of tithes and offerings alone. If you can, get some money coming in through the donor channel, get some money coming in through the co-vocational channel, now you're well on your way. But there's 2 more, and I know we're sort of, I think we're getting out of
I love this next one, nonprofit, but
yeah.
I'm assuming you're not talking about the nonprofit status of the church.
No, I am not. That is a different matter. I'm talking about the opportunity, the potential revenue stream of partnership with other nonprofit organizations. And so there's 2 kind of sides to the nonprofit stream. One of those would be partnering with existing nonprofits. So in this sense, it's this is like a subset of this side of the stream. So I don't want to get too confusing here, but in this sense, it's so it's not necessarily increasing income, but it might be reducing costs. So what I mean by that is, let's say there's a Boys and Girls Club that's active in your community, been there for a long time, and they've got a building, they've got a gym or something like that where they do their things at. And so it's a resource that you might need for meeting space or for whatever. They've got something that can help you do what you need to do. And normally for meeting space, you might have to rent it, you might have to whatever. But what if you go to the Boys and Girls Club and you say, hey, we've got 10 people on our start team. They're all people who live in this community. They've been pre-screened. We can, give you their background check reports, all that kind of stuff. They're ready to go. They're like volunteers on steroids, ready to go. They're going to be reliable. They're going to be there on time. We would like to offer whatever, 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, whatever you're willing to do, of volunteer services that you can deploy wherever you need them deployed within your system to help things work there. In exchange for, can we use your gym on Tuesday nights or whenever you're not using it or something like that. So the point is, you gain access. So you kind of barter what you have, which hopefully are some people that are on your team that are volunteers, for what you don't have, which is meeting space or resource, stuff like that. So in a sense, you lower costs. You don't necessarily create revenue that way, but you lower costs. Now, the other side of that, and this is the potential for generating revenue. There may be something that you're doing. So let's go back to the example of you've got 50% of people in your community are a single parents, and you come up with a really great strategy for serving those single parents, and that's part of the startup strategy of your church. Well, you may find that there's a granting organization out there that exists to raise money to help support single parent families and stuff like that. And they're looking for organizations that are doing things that are good, proven things to do. I actually have a friend who they plan what they're going to do in the they research the grants that are out there and figure out what the grant money is looking to do. And then they say, can we do that? And they figure out a way to do that, and it generates, income for salaries for staff. It generates income for the, renting facilities, all kinds of stuff. So this is especially in underserved communities, it's a incredibly strong potential pathway.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that. I've just a book just came out, The Coming Revolution. Just popped popped the cover up there by Mark DeMaz, and he's been doing this for years because he's done like a multi-ethnic kind of ministry in Arkansas. And I thought it was really cool because he talks about that same principle, even being able to get grants that you might not be able to get as a church by creating another nonprofit umbrella within your church, which kind of separates out because I think one of the problems we have is sometimes we're able to get grants, and we might even be able to get grants you didn't even realize you could get because so many have to be reserved for religious organizations. But sometimes the religious side keeps you from getting grants you could get elsewhere. People, when they have companies, sometimes their companies donate to nonprofits. And so what you can do is create another nonprofit within your nonprofit that will enable you to take advantage of that.
That's you took the words right out of my mouth and said it better than I would have said it. So that's exactly. And this book that you got is for this topic that we're talking about today. It's one of the books I would highly recommend that people get, because it really, Mark is prophetically speaking about. I mean, he's saying the same thing I'm saying. The coming revolution in church economics is going to hit everybody. But church planners, the great thing church planners can do is we can actually start churches that are built on the future platform instead of having to retrofit existing churches for a different economic reality that we're going to be in. So that's really good. Here's another. Let me suggest one other book really quick. It's called A Church for Monday. Church for Monday.
Monday.
Yeah. And it's written by a friend of mine, Dr. Svetlana Popazov, and she specializes in, and actually this probably fits in the next category. So I just realized this is more of the next category. So I'll just save that. I'll use that recommendation next. Just write it down, Church for Monday, and I'll tell you what that's about when we move to the next one. So,
and I think too, the other side is you flip it. Maybe the church has grown a little bit, and you're thinking, well, maybe we could utilize a facility, but maybe we're not quite there. By partnering with other nonprofits. So, for example, in our facility, there's a preschool. The preschool is its own 501c3 nonprofit. It engages people that come to our church and a ton of people that don't, and we get building revenue from them, which then offsets our overall facility costs.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And so that is, you're already doing this. I mean, that is not tithe and offering income. You are actually leveraging the facility that you have to develop revenue stream and using it, to help another nonprofit. Yeah. So that's the point, is either, especially when you're just getting started, the idea of really starting a whole new nonprofit at the same time you're trying to start a church may not be the better part of wisdom. Now I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I'm saying if you do it, you should do it with great caution. But so that's where you want to sort of lean on the side of partnering with other nonprofits and stuff like that. But as the church develops and gets stronger, you're going to end up in the place where you can be the nonprofit that other people want to partner with, and it can be a win-win. They give you some revenue and you give them some space that you're not using at certain times and things like that. So, and here's the other thing,
tax-wise, you're not liable if you're partnering with other nonprofits to have to pay taxes you wouldn't have to pay.
Right. It's way less complicated if you stay in that lane. And the other thing, though, I want to just say as an important just guideline here is you should always proceed anytime you're doing any kind of partnerships in any direction, and you're doing things like starting a 501c3 inside of the 501c3, you got to get a lawyer to help you construct that properly, you want to configure everything so you're not going to get yourself in a situation where you're putting your 501c3 status in jeopardy because you're doing something. But everything we're talking about can be done if the organization is properly structured for it, and you keep all the, the pennies have to land in the right categories, and the accounting system has to be really well done. And you don't want to be sloppy about that, because that'll come back to bite you. So make sure, I always tell people, if you're gonna, well, not if, when you pursue this path of cultivating this revenue stream of nonprofit, you definitely want to have a lawyer's voice in it and an accounting voice in it to make sure everything is being done in a way that protects the integrity, the legal and financial integrity of the church.
Yeah, which is, I think, a huge, huge point, because if you're not careful with those things, you can get yourself into just a ton of trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's what I would also say, a lot of times different sending organizations do have legal counsel and accounting things and things like that. So not everybody does, but depending on what kind of organization you're affiliated with, you may find that you can get some of that help through your sending organization, your denomination, your network, whatever. But if they don't provide it, then that doesn't mean you shouldn't get it or you don't need it. You still need it. And that's where, like, you have this friend of yours that he may or may not have the right expertise in law, but most of us, well, I think over time there may be people that are going to come along that have the ability to do law things, and they might be able to do it for a very affordable price. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, and he did have the expertise, and he actually helped us set up our 501c3 for the Kairos network, which is huge. And man, if he was not in the room, I would have been way over my head.
You would have been.
It was
you would have
great
been
to
doing
have him there.
Yeah, you would have been doing jail ministry from inside the jail as one
That's
of the
right.
inmates,
That's right. And on the flip side, yeah, you can go to something like LegalZoom and you can create it, but then I might have just had a boilerplate nonprofit status that didn't quite do what I needed it to do, and so it really is worth the money if you're going to set up another nonprofit to really just do it right the first time.
Absolutely.
And then
correct.
This last one, I love this last one, is for profit.
Yeah.
So we've had not-for-profit. Now, this one, to be honest, so much less familiar with, and rarely hear churches talk about the for-profit side. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say on this particular topic.
Yeah. Well, and we've already kind of indicated one of the reasons why this is rare is because it's more complicated, in the sense that if a nonprofit works with another nonprofit, there's no jeopardy of the tax and status. So even more so, I'll just start off up front. If you're going to pursue a for-profit approach, you definitely want to get a lawyer to help you structure things so that there's a good firewall between the for-profit activities and the nonprofit activities, and you are going to pay taxes on for-profit stuff. Okay, so let's just get that out of the way up front. But one way of viewing that is, that's horrible that we're gonna have to pay taxes. Another way of viewing it is, it has a similar effect as the co-vocational thing does in the eyes of other people. It's like, well, wait, now here's a church who's actually, paying to play here, instead of just benefiting from freebies from everybody else. This church actually generates positive revenue toward the deal. So what are we talking about here when we talk about for-profit? So again, just like the nonprofit, there's kind of two categories. In nonprofit, the category was, cooperating with other nonprofits or creating a nonprofit subset. In the for-profit, there's a similar thing going on here, and one would be, and this is probably the biggest stretch of everything I'm going to talk about, but there was a study that was done in Canada by the Canadian Church. They were talking about, the government in Canada several years ago was literally talking seriously about taking away the tax exempt status of the churches, because they just said they're a drain and a drag and all this kind of stuff. Well, somebody wondered, well, what if we looked at the actual economic benefit of a church existing in a community and see if what is that? Is it actually a drain, as most people think, because they don't pay taxes, or is there any positive economic benefit? The study, and oh man, I apologize, but I'm blanking on the name of the study. You can Google it, maybe just Google Canadian study on the value of church or something like that. It might help you get there. But here's the deal. The bottom line they came away with, the average church contributes for every dollar that is put in the offering plate. The average church actually increases value to that community of like $3 or $4. I think it was $3.25 or something like that. So in other words, dollar in creates $3.25 of actual economic positive value for the community. And so there is a case that can be made for business people to appeal to them and say, hey, just by starting this church in the community, we're going to add, there's going to be some economic value eventually added to everything. And so, by investing in the church, you can, so in a way, this is sort of like a donor appeal kind of thing, but it's appealing from a whole different direction, and actually showing them that, there could be business benefit. Now I'm not going to, spend a lot of time on that one. It's just, that's actually something to think about, and it could actually generate some, and I think the tangible way, the more stronger connection would be, you could actually appeal them and say, hey, would you consider giving a small portion of your profit on a regular basis to make sure this church is able to be here? And so in that sense, the business becomes a revenue stream that you have no control over, but they just choose to give, So it's got some connectivity back to the donor thing and all that kind of stuff. But okay, but that's one side.
Yeah.
The
and
other
if you
side,
did start a for-profit business, you would be a blessing, because your building's on the tax roll, you're invested in the community.
So that's what I'm talking about. That's the other side of this. So the one side is, you're not starting a business, because let's face it, most ministry people that I know don't, at least up to this point, have not had a lot of business experience. Okay. So, the idea that, just like I said earlier, starting a nonprofit church and a nonprofit organization at the same time, starting two things at the same time, is never a good idea. Okay.
Yeah.
So the idea of one stream is, there's already businesses there. Just go appeal to them and see if there might be somebody willing to be part of contributing to that. But the other side is, there is potential. So I mentioned the book Church for Mondays. So my friend Dr. Svetlana Popazov, she's a business person who actually specializes in entrepreneurial activities. She helps, all of her business life, she has helped other people start businesses, and she and her husband are business people, started business, but they also have a huge heart for the church. And she got this idea in her heart about, what if I started a church that was actually built around the idea that we will partner, the church will be, during the week, the place where the church meets will be a center for developing students, both grade school and junior high and high school, to all those kids. It'll be an entrepreneurial incubator kind of a place, and people actually will pay for their kids to be part of that. And so that generates for-profit revenue. They're getting paid, they're paying for a service, which is developing the entrepreneurial skills of their kids. And so it requires a place for that to happen. And so guess what happens? The business during the week, which is the time when most churches are not that active. You got one person sitting there being the secretary, answering the phone in this big building, is the typical situation with many churches. In their case, the church, the place where the church meets, has stuff going on from 8 to 5 every day where kids from the neighborhood, from the community are being trained to be business people. They're being trained in great business principles, ethical business principles, all that kind of stuff. So there's no real churchy stuff per se going on. They're not having worship services. They don't sing choruses and stuff before every class or whatever. But the kids are around, the instructors and people that are leading it are all followers of Christ. And the kids are being trained in ethical business principles. And they're, what you just said, they're being taught to understand good business as a blessing to a community, because it provides a good or a service that people desire to have at a price that is reasonable and affordable, and creates a profit for the person that's managing the business, while at the same time not exploiting or taking advantage of the people that are being served by the business, And so just all of that sort of stuff, it's super, super powerful. So this book she's written is all about this idea. So let me give you another, it's one of my favorite examples of how this works. And it's, I get this call from this guy from Minneapolis. He says, "My name is Jose Perez. God has called me to start a church in downtown Minneapolis, but I cannot figure out the ROI." And so I said, "Jose, tell me your story, because and ROI, in case people don't know,
Yeah.
is that's return on investment. It's a business term. It's very common in business world, but I'd never heard a church planner say that before. I can't figure out the ROI. But so anyway, I thought this guy's got it. So I said, "Tell me your story." He says, "I grew up in the nation of Venezuela. I became a professional dancer. I started a dance studio, ended up owning a chain of dance studios across the nation of Venezuela." So I said, "Okay, Jose, do people in Minneapolis need to know how to dance?" "Sí." "Do you know how to start a dance studio?" He said, "Sí." "Oh." And what had happened was, what had happened was Jose, the dancer and the business guy, had come to faith in Christ. He married a wonderful, actually the person that led him to faith became his wife, his missionary. She was a missionary to Venezuela, a Christian missionary.
Wow.
She led him to faith. They ended up moving back to the United States and got involved. He ended up becoming a pastor in a church along with her. They were staff pastors in a church, and so in his mind, he had left the business world behind, kind of like your lawyer friend. He had left the business world behind to be in full-time ministry, and so he had really kind of turned off that part of his. He didn't. So when he thought about starting a church, he only thought about, how do I pay the bills? Because he knew there's this gap between when people start coming and the money starts coming in. He was just trying to figure out, how do I cover that gap? And so when I just, all I did was reconnect him with what God had already put in him. And he was like, "Oh my goodness," because what is a dance studio but a big room that's empty where you dance, and what's a church but a big room that has chairs in it, and some churches dance. So, anyway, so what he did was he started One Reason Dance Studio first. About 6 months 6 months after that conversation, he started One Reason Dance Studio. And built his clientele. People from the community, people from the neighborhood were coming there to learn how to dance. And then on Sundays, they just built relationships, connected with people. People began to come to faith and things like that. And 6 months after that, he started One Reason Church. And guess what? The dance studio pays for the building, and the church basically, the income from the church, the tithes and offerings, have grown to the place where they're taking care. In fact, just this past week, they actually started holding 2 services. They're having so many people come to the church now. They ran out of space. They're going to 2 services, and his dance studio is flourishing. And so now I don't know if you're thinking this, but when I hear that, when I tell that story, I think I could never do that. Because the problem is, I am not a dancer in any stretch of the
Yeah.
imagination.
But
I would
you
be.
boil it down to the why. I think of two stories. I had a buddy or a guy I know that started a church in Orlando. And when he was starting the church, he was looking around the community and he realized, man, this is just, I feel like we're just taking. And so he ended up starting a coffee shop,
Right.
Credo Coffee. And it's
Yep.
ended up launching in a couple locations, does sustainable coffee. It's donation based, which is really unique.
Yeah.
And that ended up being their foothold into the community and launching the
Right.
ministry. Another story of a Lutheran church up in Minnesota that they took a dying congregation and they went into the basement of that congregation and started a 24-hour fitness studio. The
Yep.
guy had a lot of experience in that. Through the fitness studio, have launched a ministry that is just reaching all kinds of very disconnected
Yes.
people. And
Yes.
so I think the principle is not, start a dance studio or a coffee shop
Right.
but what could you do that would
Right.
allow you to serve the community and then launch
Exactly.
church out of that?
Yes, yes. And when you start going down this pathway, the opportunities are just amazing. So think about this. I've actually arrived at the conclusion that I feel like it is at the very least it's poor stewardship. It might even be sinful for any building to sit empty 90% of the time. That building needs to be formatted and structured in a way that it can generate revenue. Just like you were talking about with your partnership with the nonprofits, you're generating revenue with your building, uh, and that's so. So I would just challenge anybody, especially with existing church, and you have a building. If your building's sitting empty most of the time, look for ways to get that building working at the very least pay for itself, because that takes a burden off the money that the church has. And so yeah, you're right. The principle here is either within your own experience, or in partnership with somebody else. So I would say Jose was uniquely qualified to do what he did.
Yeah.
And it's a great story, but it's probably not a great example for people to try to follow, not only because of the dance thing, but just because most people, it would not be a wise thing to try to start a business and a church in the same season.
Yeah.
And so it's better when you're thinking about this, if you don't have a business background, to think about, who do I know that does? Who do I know that I can partner with that has business experience, that we can, start an entrepreneurial school, and that will pay for the building. In other words, the partnership potential here is amazing. So when you think about, partnership, and you think about maximizing the asset that you have in the building and creating revenue through the building. See the building as a potential revenue generator instead of a cost thing. Most people just think of a building of, oh man, there's maintenance costs, mortgages, rent, all that stuff. They think of it as a cost versus what if it becomes a revenue stream, and maybe even pays for itself, and it maybe even generates positive revenue. There's churches that
Yeah.
do event centers. They actually have structured their buildings so that they are usable by anybody in the community, and they have an easy way to rent different space. Now that means you can't just leave kids stuff laying around. You have to, it does affect how the church operates a little bit, but if it generates revenue, that's a good thing. So there's just, I think we've only just begun to see the beginning of the edge of the potential here. I just think we need to stop. I do know there's got to be caution exercised, because again, you can put your nonprofit status in jeopardy if you don't handle this well, because the whole idea of nonprofit is it has to be not for profit. And so but again, a lawyer can help you structure things so that the nonprofit activities are segregated from the for-profit. And the for-profit, there's no problem with the for-profit becoming a way, a stream of income into the nonprofit to fund their operations, but you've got to you never can let the nonprofit money flow into the for-profit, like, okay, now we're
Yeah.
going to, that's when, I mean, there's probably even a way to do that, but you have to do it with with a lot of wisdom and care so that you don't put yourself in jeopardy. And but I think, again, it's an area we have to be willing to explore in order for us to thrive, for the church to thrive into the 21st century. All 5 of these revenue streams have to be thoroughly developed, thoroughly explored, and put on steroids.
I love it. Well, Steve, I can't thank you enough for digging into this conversation. If you guys want to explore these conversations, you can go on www.lifeofchurchplanner.com. We also have been recording these for a training app that we have called the Kairos Network mobile app, which is a part of a church plant training pipeline. And here's the best part. The app is free for church planters and church plant trainers to use. You can utilize that. We have other networks that have partnered with that as well, to be able to utilize that as a resource to help train and develop. And I will tell you about the app, though. If you're trying to learn to plant a church, get a great coach, get a great trainer, because I'm sorry, there's no substitute for getting to sit down with a guy like Steve and glean from his experience, and it will save you a world of pain and hurt, but it'll also help you really plant out the best possible church that God wants you to plant. So Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to dig into this. And I'm looking forward to next month when we get to talk about moving from program focused to discipleship focused.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's going to be powerful.
Well, till next time, guys, we'll see you later.
All right.